common with many other people in this country, I found that the initial story out of Dallas on Friday the 22nd of November 1963 was so highly implausible.
Welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, as I try to separate the wheat from the chaff and give you something substantial on the JFK assassination rather than some of the usual nonsense you find on the internet and on YouTube. So today, sort of a special edition of On the Trail of Delusion. I want to go through a book that has meant a lot to me as I've my 50 years of researching the JFK assassination, and that's Sylvia Meagher's book, Accessories After the Fact. I got into the assassination in 1975 when I was watching the Geraldo Rivera show. That got me into it. I was 18 years old, and the next day I went to the library at Dawson College in Montreal, which was a community college, and I looked up the books on the JFK assassination, and I found Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment. They didn't have that many books. They certainly didn't have the 26 volumes of evidence. But I devoured Mark Lane's book, and over the course of the next year, started reading everything I could on the assassination, and there were articles coming out because it was back in the news, because of Geraldo Rivera. It was 1975. And everywhere I turned, people were writing that the best book on the assassination was Sylvia Meagher's Accessories After the Fact. But the book was out of print, and it was not available. It wasn't in any library in Montreal. I went to all the used bookstores, and it wasn't there. And so it was very frustrating that I couldn't get my hands on what everybody said was the best book. I was very frustrated. And so one day, I guess it was the spring of 1976, I was at university now, at Concordia University in Montreal, and on a spring day in the afternoon, I was off. I had finished classes, and I decided to go into W.H. Smith, which was a British bookseller that had a branch on St. Catherine Street in Montreal. And so I walk in, I just wanted to see what was new, and I go to the nonfiction section, and there standing right in front of me is this book, Accessories After the Fact. This copy right here, this is actually the book I bought in the spring of 1976. It's over 50 years old, and I still have it. And I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw it. It was like, wow, they've reprinted it. It's out now. I was just so delighted to finally get it. And I rushed home and I started reading the book. And right at the start of the book, I had problems. And I should show you. The first part was the first section, right in the chapter 1, the speed of the presidential car. It's a small bit. It's only a page, two pages. And I read that, and I didn't understand what the point of it was. And she's talking about the limousine slowing down. Did it stop? And I thought, well, there's films of the assassination. I was stuck. I didn't get why this was so important, why it was in her book, what the relevance was. So I had to sort of ignore that and go past. So I read the book, and I was very, very impressed with the book. It made a very, very big impression on me at the time. And I have to say, probably looking back, I didn't pay as much attention to the Warren Report as I should have, and I was much more enamored of all the conspiracy literature, and this book played a very, very big part of it. Now, the reason I'm doing this video is I'm writing a new book on a history of conspiratorial thinking in the JFK assassination, and I'm at the part of my book where Sylvia Meagher comes out with Accessories, and I decided I had to go back and reread this book and see, what I thought about the book today in light of what I know and what I think. And so I did that. By the way, before I get into that, I want to show you. I had to go out, and I went on the internet a few years ago, and I bought a first edition of Sylvia Meagher's book. This was the first edition in hardcover, which came out in 1967, and it's got a preface by Léo Sauvage. And on the back cover of the book, there's actually a blurb here from Mark Lane, who recommended the book. And I should tell you, that started a whole big kerfuffle, because Mark Lane reviewed an initial manuscript of Accessories After the Fact, which did not have the paragraph at the end about Jim Garrison, where she was very critical of his investigation. And once this book came out, and Lane read that part of the book, he was incensed, and he wrote a letter to Sylvia and to Bobbs Merrill saying, Please don't use my name in any advertisements. There were advertisements with Mark Lane's name. Take my name off the advertisements unless you want to take that paragraph off. And that was a massive amount of letter writing back and forth between him and Sylvia Meagher. And in fact, I'll put the link in to my blog. I have all those letters on my blog. Let's go into this book. And when this book came out, it was really well received. You know, it wasn't as widely reviewed as Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment or as Edward J. Epstein's Inquest, but it was reviewed, typically reviewed with Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas. A lot of reviews looked at both books together, and most of the reviews were pretty favorable for Accessories After the Fact. Edward J. Epstein reviewed the book for the Washington Post, their book magazine, and he said it was the most exhaustive and objective evaluation of the Warren Report, and that it was a definitive analysis. And he also wrote that this book completes the Warren Report by supplying the contradictory evidence the Commission ignored or missed. Connor Cruz O'Brien, who was a very major public intellectual, he wrote in the magazine The Minority of One that no one with any regard for the evidence can read Accessories After the Fact and then consider the lone assassin theory to be anything better than improbable. And so there were some very, very good reviews of the book. But there were some reviewers that were actually, who knew the case or actually went beyond a cursory look at this book, were somewhat critical. So George Cook wrote in the Washington Post Book World that when I read nonfiction, I prefer to start with the part that comes off the printing press last. If it is compiled with skill, an index can tell us more about the book, the subject matter, and the author than the chapters within. And so in his review, he actually went to the index in the back. Mars Index, and he looked under, just an example, he sort of said, under Warren Commission, there were 422 page references to the Warren Commission in this book, but they're broken down evenly, and he listed the subheadings, and I thought it's quite telling. There's subheadings: bias and predisposition, delays in investigation of evidence, failure to investigate suspicious circumstances, illogical and double standards, impeachment of witnesses, inadequate and incomplete investigation, inattention or indifference to evidence, and manipulation and distorted presentation of facts. And so it gives you an idea of sort of the biases of Sylvia Meagher. Fred Graham reviewed Accessories in the New York Times, and he said, unfortunately, her meticulous skills as an indexer carried over to produce a book that is a bore. It catalogs the weak spots in the Warren Report and intersperses the inconsistent material she discovered, but there is little organization and no change of pace. She does not appear to have unearthed any new shockers, but that is not certain. She cries wolf so often that a big bad one could have slipped by unnoticed. And in Esquire, Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a British commentator, wrote that Mrs. Meagher defends so many doubtful propositions that her championship of the more convincing ones loses its effect. Surely, one says to oneself, the Warren Commission can't always have blundered and cheated. There must have been some times when they hit on the truth. And that is one of the things that I find absolutely amazing. That here is a book, and you have to remember that Sylvia Meagher indexed the 26 volumes of evidence. I mean, she spent a lot of time pouring through those books, preparing an index, which a lot of people used, and she wrote this book. And what does she come to conclude after going through the 26 volumes? That Lee Harvey Oswald was innocent of everything. Innocent of the Kennedy assassination, innocent of the Tippit murder, and that he did not fire at General Walker. I mean, talk about missing the forest for the trees. I mean, my God, it says a lot about her to actually go through the 26 volumes and conclude that Lee Harvey Oswald is innocent. I mean, I find that absolutely astounding to this day. I mean, wow. It's a very, very biased book. There's a lot of biases in this book, and you can see it right up front at its dedication. This book is dedicated to the innocent victims of a society which often inflicts indignity, imprisonment, and even death on the obscure and helpless. I mean, that's her dedication to this book, and it sort of speaks to some of her biases. And I think the other thing that really gets me now is that you talk about a rush to judgment. Sylvia Meagher is very upset in her book with many of the writers who went very quickly into print to champion the Warren Report without examining the 26 volumes. And she writes, the difficulty is that editorial writers and partisans of the report rushed into a chorus of superlatives before they could read the 880-page report with requisite care, and long before the supporting documents and testimony were made available for study and comparison. Now, that's not a bad thing to say. I mean, it's probably very, very true. A lot of people were saying the Warren Report was great before they got to the 26 volumes. But in fact, Sylvia Meagher did much the same thing. So in November 1964, she wrote a 60-page critique of the Warren Commission report. This is November 1964, before the 26 volumes came out. What's amazing is that her critique, she critiqued the Warren Report, and it was based on newspaper accounts and quotations from newspapers. And so she didn't have the evidence in 26 volumes, but it didn't stop her from criticizing the Warren Report. And, you know, again, it's missing the forest for the trees. She insists in her book that the 26 volumes, quote, instead of corroborating the verdict reached by the Warren Commission, creates a reasonable doubt of Oswald's guilt and even a powerful presumption of his complete innocence of all the crimes of which he was accused. Really, all the crimes. He's innocent. I mean, it's an astounding conclusion for somebody to make. And so how does she do that? And so the only way that Sylvia Meagher can conclude that Oswald was innocent was to ignore and downplay all the evidence against him. So let's go through some of the evidence. I'm not going to do a complete analysis of everything in this book because it would be a 2-hour video, and nobody wants to watch a 2-hour video of me talking about Meagher's book. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So take the cartridge cases. So they found 3 cartridge cases at the 6th floor window. They were found to have been fired from Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano rifle to the exclusion of all other rifles. So what does she say about that? Well, she says the Warren Commission, quote, offers no evidence of such purchase or possession of the 4 cartridges or of the larger supply of ammunition which they were presumably obtained. So she is dismissing the evidence of the cartridges because the Warren Commission couldn't determine where Oswald had bought the ammunition. Now, there were 2 gun shops in Dallas that sold such ammunition, and, you know, Oswald could have gone there on any day and bought a box of ammunition. Nobody would remember that he had been there, and also don't remember there wasn't barcodes. They didn't have a computerized inventory of credit cards. We wouldn't have used a credit card. It would have been cash. And so, not surprisingly, you know, it's not easy to determine where he bought the ammunition. But, I mean, could you imagine any murder case today where the police would say, well, we have all this evidence against the accused, but we don't know where he bought his ammunition, so we'll dismiss the charges. It just wouldn't happen that way. Or take his rifle. There was a lot of evidence to link the Mannlicher Carcano rifle found on the 6th floor to Lee Harvey Oswald. His handwriting was on the purchase order. The money order was Oswald's. The rifle was shipped to his post office box in Dallas. Marina Oswald took the photographs of Oswald with the rifle and his pistol in the backyard. Fibers found between the butt plate and the wooden stock matched Oswald's shirt. I mean, there's a lot of evidence linking the rifle to Oswald. So what does Meagher say? Well, all she could say is bring up is the quote, the vanished Mauser. And she goes on, they must have found a Mauser on the 6th floor. And she's very upset that the Warren Commission didn't show Seymour Weitzman, the officer who sort of found the Carcano, for identification. And her conclusion is the question of the identity of the rifle found in the book depository still awaits conclusive determination. What can I say? Now, what really takes the cake in her book is the murder of J.D. Tippit. So here we have 4 cartridge cases were recovered from the site of the Tippit killing. All 4 of them were found to have been fired from Oswald's revolver to the exclusion of all other guns. So what does Meagher say about that? Well, all she says here is that the 4 shells did not correspond exactly with the 4 bullets recovered from Tippit's body, and that the bullets were too mangled to be identified as having been fired from any specific weapons. And that's it. With that, she can basically eliminate the 4 shells and the fact they were fired from Oswald's pistol. Now, the 4 cartridge cases comprise 2 Western .38 specials and 2 Remington Peters .38 specials. The 4 bullets recovered from Tippett's bodies were 3 Western .38s and 1 Remington Peters. And so there was this mismatch. And the Warren Commission said, well, basically, this could have been rectified by if Oswald had fired 5 shots and 3 shots were Western, 2 Remington Peters, 1 bullet was missing and 1 cartridge case was missing, and that would be fine. And the other thing that Meagher does note, but the fact is that Oswald had 6 live cartridges in his revolver when he was arrested, 3 Western and 3 Remington Peters Special .38s. I mean, wouldn't that tell you right away that's the kind of ammunition he was using? And they found bullets in his pocket. 5 bullets were found in his pocket. They were all Westerns. I mean, this should speak something to you, the fact that this was the kind of ammunition he had. She also finds it unusual that, why would he miss a shot? Why would they miss a shell if there was one? Well, Oswald was unloading his shells all the way along as he was running away. It's easy that somebody could have missed one or somebody could have found one and not said anything. And she also says that the witnesses only heard 2 to 4 shots and nobody heard 5 shots. Well, in fact, there was one witness who Ted Calloway did hear exactly 5 shots. And the fact is, because people heard 2 to 4, many people did not know how many shots were fired. It's not unusual. But to Meagher, this speaks to Oswald's innocence. And of course, what she doesn't mention at all is that Joseph Nickel, who was the superintendent of the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation for the state of Illinois, found that one of those bullets could have been identified with Oswald's gun. Now that's in the 26 volumes. He testified. She must have read it, but she doesn't mention it. She could have mentioned it and dismissed it and said, well, the FBI disagreed, and the FBI did disagree because they were much more conservative. But she doesn't mention that, and of course she doesn't mention that the bullets that were too mangled to be identified still had all the hallmarks being fired from a Mannlicher Carcano rifle. They looked like they had been. Everything was consistent with those bullets with a Mannlicher with his revolver. So she leaves that out. And then the witnesses, the Tippett witnesses. I mean, look at the witnesses. You had Helen Markham, Barbara Davis, Virginia Davis, William Scoggins, Sam Ginyard, Ted Calloway, Warren Reynolds, Pat Patterson, Harold Russell. They all identified Oswald as either the man they saw shooting Tippett, that was Markham, and the others all saw him run away from the scene with a gun. Jimmy Burt, Bill Smith, Domingo Benavides, and L.J. Lewis saw the person who killed Tippett, but they couldn't identify the man as being Oswald. But they didn't say it wasn't Oswald. And so 9 of the 13 identified Oswald, 4 weren't sure, and none of the 13 said that the cop killer was not Oswald. You'd think that would make some sort of an impression on Sylvia Meagher. But it didn't. None of it mattered. And it didn't matter because she felt the lineups were unfair. And because the lineups were unfair, or in her opinion, she could throw out all of that witness testimony, all of it she could throw out. And of course, what's really astounding is that at a trial, any of those witnesses could have been called to identify Oswald. They would have been called to the stand. Do you identify the man you saw running from the scene? They would have pointed to Oswald. And that would have been that. I mean, the fact that the lineups might have been unfair, I don't think anybody would have brought that up or would have, it was immaterial once they're actually identified in court. Scoggins, she said Scoggins was not a credible witness because a bush obstructed his view. But basically, he saw Oswald approach Tippett, then his view was obstructed, he heard the shots, and then he saw Oswald running away with a gun in his hand. I mean, why would you want to dismiss that? I mean, this is pretty important. The Davis sisters saw Oswald run across their lawn. They saw him unload some cartridges from his revolver, and they picked them up and gave them to police. And then identified him in the lineup. Now, you want to dismiss all of that because you think that lineup might have been a little bit unfair? I mean, oh my God. And then Warren Reynolds. Marr says that Warren Reynolds did not identify Oswald, but he changed his testimony in July 64 after he'd been shot in the head. Well, it's true. He was shot in the head in January 1964 by somebody who was breaking into into the place where they sold cars. But before that, before he was shot, he told the FBI, quote, "He is of the opinion Oswald is the person he had followed on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. Now, he couldn't be certain, but he did say Oswald was the person. But the point is that, so why would you shoot him to change his testimony? You already had many other people who clearly identified Oswald. You didn't need Warren Reynolds. And so at the end of her chapter on the witnesses, Marr says that the eyewitness identifications are highly vulnerable and would have been torn to shreds in a courtroom. And, again, just not true. And it's really surprising that she would say some of this. Now, where she was most unfair, she was incredibly unfair to Helen Markham. And quote, this is her paragraph from her section on the witnesses. Quote, "The testimony of Helen Markham, the other eyewitness to the shooting, has been denounced sufficiently by critics of the Warren Report. I do not wish to further belabor the point that she lacks any semblance of credibility. She said that she was alone with Tippit for 20 minutes before an ambulance arrived, and that Tippit, who is said to have died instantaneously, tried to talk to her. She was in hysterics and somehow managed to leave her shoes on the top of Tippit's car. Sedatives had to be administered before she was taken to view the lineup at 4:30 on Friday." So that's her paragraph on Markham. Now here's the truth about Markham. The shoes that Markham left on the top of Tippit's car were her work shoes. They were in a bag. She was a waitress. She was going to work. She was carrying her shoes in a bag. And at the scene, she put the shoes on top of Tippit's car. There's nothing really crazy about that. Sedatives were not administered at the police station. They gave her ammonia. It's actually a stimulant. She was fainting. She was very, very much, she was crazy after what had happened. She may have thought that Tippit was trying to talk, but what she heard was gurgling sounds from Tippit's body, and she misinterpreted that as an attempt to speak. And given the shock that she saw the shooting, she was in shock. So it's not surprising that she lost track of time. So I think that Marr is incredibly unfair to Helen Markham. And then if you go to her testimony, and this is right from Marr's book. So Marr quotes her testimony, and she just gives a small segment of Markham's testimony, and she quotes, "Mr. Ball says, now when you went into the room, you looked these people over, these four men." She says, "Yes. Did you recognize anyone in the lineup?" She says, "No." "Did you recognize anybody from their face?" And she said, "No." "Did you identify anybody of those four people?" "I don't know nobody." And Marr really picks us out. What is she talking about? Well, the fact is that she thought that Ball was asking her before the shooting, "Did you know anybody? Did you know these guys in the lineup? Did you know this man?" And she said no. And then at the end of the segment that Sylvia Meagher uses, she quotes Markham as saying, "Number 2 is the one I picked," and she leaves some testimony out. "Number 2 is the man I saw shoot the policeman," and she leaves some more out. "I looked at him. When I saw this man, I wasn't sure, but I had cold chills just run all over me." End of quote. That's what she quotes Markham as saying. And then Marr wryly notes that, quote, "Reading this testimony about the identification on which the commission relied, I feel a few cold chills too." Now, what she doesn't tell you, and of course she doesn't tell you about why Markham says what she does, but then she leaves out a lot of Markham's other testimony. And so Ball asks again about the man in the lineup, and she says, "When I saw the man, I wasn't so sure. I told him I wanted to be sure, and looked at his face. Mostly is what I looked at, on account of his eyes, the way he looked at me. So I asked them if they would turn them sideways. They did. Then they turned them back around, and I said the second. And they said, which one? And I said number 2. So when I said that, I just kind of fell over. Everyone in there, from beginning to talk, I just didn't know. And Ball says, did you recognize the man from his clothing or from his face? And Markham says, from his face. Were you sure it was the same man you had seen before? I am sure. And then she says, I would know the man anywhere. I know I would. all of that is left out of Sylvia Meagher's book, the positive identification of Markham, of Oswald as the killer. Now, what's also important about this book is not so much what's in it, although there's a lot of interesting stuff in it that I want to talk about, but what's not in it. So she's got a long section on Jack Ruby at the end. And there's not one word in the section about Jack Ruby but anti-Semitism. It's not in her index as well. It's not even in her book, actually the index book that she wrote in the Warren Report, Anti-Semitism, regarding Jack Ruby. And the plain fact of the matter is that anti-Semitism played a large part in Jack Ruby's life. He was deeply concerned about the Bernard Weissman ad the morning of November 22nd in the Dallas Morning News. Thought Weissman was a Jewish name. It was. And after the assassination, he was concerned that maybe the Jews would be blamed for the Kennedy assassination. And that was the start of him going downhill mentally because of that. And there's no mention of that at all in Sylvia Meagher's book. It's quite an omission. And then one of the things that she does include in her book, and I'm quite surprised, but she has a 3-page section on the mysterious deaths. And she's got a list of people that she claims died mysteriously. And you look at this list, and I mean, obviously she was influenced by Penn Jones, but some of the names on the list, I mean, she's got Earlene Roberts, and that was the housekeeper at the rooming house on Beckley. And the fact that she died of a heart attack in January 1966. Now, why is that mysterious? In fact, she had an autopsy. She died of natural causes. Why was this important? I mean, she has on her list David Ferry, right? And she says he died of an apparent suicide, but he didn't die of an apparent suicide. He died of natural causes, and she must have been aware because she had a subscription to the New Orleans Times Picayune. She must have known about the fact that Ferry had a full forensic autopsy, and he died of a berry aneurysm. But it's on her list, and you go down her list, and she's got, Teresa Norton, who was a dancer employed by Ruby. Marilyn Moon Wall, who was a dancer employed by Ruby. She was shot by her husband in September 66. I mean, what on earth does this have to do with the JFK assassination? Why is this important? Why is this? And you go through the whole list, and it's like that. It just, and at the end of her chapter, she says, quote, "Viewed subjectively, the witnesses appear to be dying like flies." I mean, really? I mean, really, I expect better from Sylvia Meagher. Then she says, "It may be that the deaths are within the normal rates, despite the appearance of an epidemic. An epidemic? Or it may be that they are radically out of line. Pending a more authoritative pronouncement, it can only be hoped that the surviving witnesses will be on guard against misadventure." Really, that's going low. And again, I should say, it's not just Penn Jones, because she had a section on mysterious deaths in her November 1964 manuscript. Some of the other things that she bought in her book, she actually buys into the second Oswald. And she's upset that the Warren Report doesn't acknowledge the possibility that Oswald was being impersonated. And here's a quote which really bugs me. She says, "The hearing suggested the commission actively entertained the suspicion that Larry Crawford, an associate of Jack Ruby, might have impersonated Oswald." Well, no, they never said that Crawford impersonated Oswald. They were thought that perhaps Crawford might have been mistaken for Oswald, and that's why they showed his picture. That was it. It wasn't. They never thought he was impersonated. And then she has 2 pages on about the man in the doorway, which was thought to be Oswald, but it was Billy Lovelady. And then she wonders why the commission didn't show witnesses Lovelady's photo instead of Crawford's photo when it came to people who looked like Oswald. Well, the reason they didn't show Lovelady's photo is that Crawford worked at Ruby's club, and so it was natural to show it to people who worked with Ruby, and it was natural that maybe he was the guy. I mean, it didn't make sense to show Lovelady's photo around. Meagher's shooting sequence. She has a very, very big chart of the rifle tests that were used by the Warren Commission, the FBI, to test the shots. And in her shooting sequence, she says that the alleged assassin had a maximum of 5.6 seconds. Well, that's not true. If the first shot missed, the alleged assassin, of course we know it was Oswald, would have had 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds. 10 seconds to shoot the 3 shots. But she misleads people by saying it was a maximum of 5.6 seconds. Of course, Meagher can't admit that Oswald shot at General Walker. And so she presents the note that Oswald wrote to his wife Marina that was found afterwards. And she does believe that it was a real note written by Oswald, but she says, quote, "I suggest that Oswald wrote the undated letter in relation to a project other than an attack on General Walker, one that also involved risk of arrest or death, and that Marina Oswald was informed about her husband's plans in advance." Okay, I mean, she dismisses, and she really doesn't really comment much on Marina's testimony, except elsewhere in the book to really claim that we should throw out all of Marina's testimony because she was lying about everything. I mean, she really says some nasty things about Marina. Going back to the shooting sequence, again, what Meagher doesn't mention is Marina's testimony in Volume 1, pages 14 to 15. She is asked whether Oswald had practiced with his rifle. And Marina says, "I think that he went once or twice. I didn't actually see him take the rifle, but I knew that he was practicing." And then she also does not show her readers Commission Exhibit 239, which was Oswald's scorebook in the Marines. And you could see his various scores over time where he was incredibly proficient in the Marines with the rifle, really hitting the target square on many, many, many times. But she doesn't show any of those results. But she does have time to spend on a whole variety of things that are really quite irrelevant. So the chicken lunch, the fact that Bonnie Ray Williams was eating a chicken sandwich and a Coke on the 6th floor just after noon on November 22nd, and he left the chicken sandwich and the Coke, the bag, on the 6th floor. She spends 2 pages on this lunch. And she gets very concerned. I mean, even though Bonnie Ray Williams says it was his lunch, that's still not good enough for Sylvia Meagher. And so, again, she combines this with some of her standard invective against the Warren Report. Quote, "The confused and contradictory testimony on the chicken remains permits little trust in a case that rests largely on evidence gathered by investigators of such dubious incompetence. The Warren Commission has nevertheless seen to it that this chicken will not come home to roost in the quarters of the Dallas police. There is no sign that the commission was perturbed by the mad variety of testimony." She can offer a turn of phrase, but really this really was unnecessary and quite silly. And then she spent 6 pages in her book on the jacket that Oswald left after he was running away from the Tippit scene. 6 pages, and this is where it gets crazy. So people mark them, and the jacket was described as white, and it was a gray jacket. And this is a quote from her. "Are we to assume that the witnesses, including a police officer trained in accurate observation, saw a gray jacket, but mistakenly called it white? Or did they call it white because it was in fact white?" Well, if you're mistaking a gray jacket for white, you're pretty close. Really, that's not much to go on to dismiss the jacket. But Meagher can't accept that it was Oswald's jacket because she thinks Oswald was innocent. And she completely leaves out, or she does have a chapter on Oswald's motive, but of course Meagher can't find a motive. It's inexplicable to her. There's no motive known. The Warren Commission struggled with this, but Meagher cannot think of any motive for Oswald to have killed Kennedy. She talks about Oswald's admiration of Kennedy. He liked Kennedy. He hated the John Birch Society. And so, she understood, well, okay, I understood why you might want to go after Walker because he was part of that right-wing milieu, but why on earth would he go after Kennedy? Doesn't make sense to her. But in fact, what she missed out, and again, it's all in 26 volumes, he hated capitalism. He hated communism. He hated both systems. And in fact, he wrote, I despise the representatives of both systems. And in fact, Marr clearly must know about Oswald's love of Fidel Castro, his love of Cuba. He was incensed by what Kennedy and the Kennedy administration was doing to Cuba. He was horrified. He hated it. He was protesting in the streets. He had leaflets. He was pissed off with Kennedy, what Kennedy was doing. Yeah, he might have liked the man, he might have liked the family, but he was pissed off what the administration, what Kennedy was doing. And there was a motive, but just Marr couldn't see it. And she also completely doesn't talk about Oswald's propensity for violence. So she doesn't mention the fact that Oswald had told a friend that he would have liked to have killed Eisenhower. She dismisses the Warren Report's mention of Oswald's capacity for violence. She does not mention the fact that he was beating Marina. Her black eyes were not mentioned. The fact that Oswald pulled a knife on his half-brother's wife. The fact that a neighbor of Oswald's saw him chasing John Pick with a long butcher knife and threw it at him, but missed. All of that is not mentioned by Marr. She must have read it. It's in the 26 volumes, but she doesn't discuss it. Now, she was right about one thing, and that was Jim Garrison. Marr was right about Jim Garrison. She understood that his investigation was ridiculous and that he was a charlatan. And at the end of her book, she writes, quote, but as the Garrison investigation continued to unfold, it gave cause for increasingly serious misgivings about the validity of his evidence, the credibility of his witnesses, and the scrupulousness of his methods. The fact that many critics of the Warren Report have remained passionate advocates of the Garrison investigation, even condoning tactics which they might not condone on the part of others, is a matter for regret and disappointment. Nothing less than strict factual accuracy and absolute moral integrity must be deemed permissible if justice is indeed to be served. She was right about Garrison, but unfortunately, Sylvia Meagher blew her credibility years later. She was asked by Prentice Hall to be a referee for Garrison's book. This was the book that he had written before On the Trail of the Assassins. He had written this book. He had submitted it to many publishers. It was rejected all over the place, but Prentice Hall was interested, and they suggested Sylvia Meagher as a referee. Now, Garrison knew that Meagher was very critical of him, but it was hard for him to turn down Meagher because of her reputation as a Warren Commission critic. So he accepted Meagher as the referee. She wrote a 26-page critique of Garrison's book, and she knew, and she wrote just how ridiculous his chapters in the book on New Orleans were. Now, this book that he wrote was not a first-person narrative. This was sort of a standard text on the JFK assassination, very similar to her book in Rush of Judgment. So she knew, and she wrote that the chapter on New Orleans was nonsense. But she actually recommended to Prentice Hall that they publish the book. And the reason that she recommended that they publish the book was that now Garrison was saying that Oswald was innocent. Remember, back in '67, when Garrison indicted Clay Shaw for perjury, he said Lee Harvey Oswald was a co-conspirator. And that incensed Meagher back at the time. But now Garrison was saying Oswald was innocent, and that overrode anything. Yes, she knew Garrison was a charlatan, but the fact he was saying Oswald was innocent, that was enough for her to recommend that Prentice Hall publish the book. And they actually decided not to publish it because they felt that Garrison was not honest about the motorcade, the changing the motorcade route, and he had also promised a lot of information about the CIA and the involvement of Fred Chrisman in the assassination, and he didn't provide any real evidence, so they decided to not accept the book. And of course, we all know what happened. He eventually hired Zachary Sklar to help him rewrite the book, as a first-person narrative, and it was accepted by Sheridan Square Press and published as On the Trail of the Assassins. So the final word about Sylvia Meagher, I'll give it to Donald Stanley, and this was his December 1967 column in the San Francisco Examiner. Smart guy. And this was a column in which he was giving a variety of backhanded prizes to books which he did not like very much. And he gave the Billy Joe Award for original creation of an instant folk hero to Sylvia Meagher, who, in her book Accessories After the Fact, sees in Lee Harvey Oswald a figure of, quote, personal pride and dignity. Yes, she wrote that. Personal pride and dignity. And I thought that's a fitting end to this. The fact that Sylvia Meagher was blinded by her biases in her belief that Oswald was completely innocent. And I have to say, this book certainly doesn't hold up now, but even under using just the evidence she had at her disposal, the 26 volumes, the book just doesn't make it. It's a really bad book. And a lot of us, including me, were taken in back in the day. And so that's the truth about Accessories After the Fact.